When most people think of Sudan, I would argue they think of the Second Civil War, which lasted for over 20 years from 1983 to 2005, and the notable atrocities committed during the war, including genocide and slavery. However, while receiving less global attention, I think it's vital to understand the reasoning and causes for the First Sudan Civil War, which lasted from 1955 to 1972, before you can understand the cultural and political climate that led to violent and divisive conflict in Sudan in general. While many simplify the First Sudan Civil War into a religious and cultural identity conflict between the intersection of an Islamic majority population in North Sudan and a Christian and local African religious majority in South Sudan, the cause of the First Sudan Civil War was actually due to a multitude of factors reflecting the cultural and ethnic diversity of the country, including a pattern of exploitative governance developed by the Sudanic states in its period under the Ottoman Empire, inequities in economic, education, and political power during British colonial rule, which favored the North but adversely affected the South, and the continued neglect or outright disregardance of the Southern perspective and ideas of self-determination by the Northern Sudanese government to further its implementation of its Islamic militant agenda. Before I can dive into the multitude of factors that caused the First Sudan Civil War, a brief context is needed of the very culturally and ethnically diverse country that Sudan was in 1956 and still is today, to understand the backdrop to this conflict. The Sudan's population is one of the most diverse of the African continent. In Chapter 1 of the book, Sudan, A State of War, the Clingendale Institute describes this diversity, writing, "Given the long history of racial mixing, differences are not racial, but rather culturally linguistic. Two main fault lines distinguish between Arab, 30 to 40% of the population, and non-Arabs, 60 to 70% of the population, and between Muslims, 70% of the population, and non-Muslims, 30%, including 10% population who are Christians. The first group is made of the Arabs who speak Arabic and profess Islam and live in the north of the country. The second group includes Muslims of Black African descent, mostly settled in the western part of Sudan or the Darfur region. On the opposite eastern side, the Kustektik Behu are also Muslim, but are neither Arab nor African blacks, and therefore constitute a separate subgroup. Thirdly, the south of Sudan is inhabited by Nilotic Christians and populations with indigenous beliefs. These groups differ radically in their daily life and cultural practices. These cultural and linguistic differences are drastically relevant when it comes to understanding the main causes for the First Sudan Civil War. While foreign and internal political, economic, and social forces which favored the North but adversely affected the South became more pronounced in the colonial years leading up to the First Sudan Civil War, the first main cause of the war can be traced to a history of patterns of exploitative governance from the central state to the rich, the influence of the army in economic and political matters, and the prevalence of slave trading and raiding was actually developed by the Sudanic states governments and during the Ottoman Empire's rule prior to the 20th century. In the academic journal, The Root Causes of Sudan's Civil Wars, Old Wars, and New Wars, author Douglas H. Johnson points out the pattern in inequities in economic, education, and political power predated the unequal colonial system of the 20th century and can be found in the ideas of power and governance that developed in the Sudanic states of the 18th and 19th centuries, were incorporated into the structure of the Turco-Egyptian Empire during the 1800s, and found new force in the Jihad state of the Mahdiya in the 1880s and 1890s before being eventually adopted into the 20th century colonial state. During the Turco-Egyptian Empire rule, Ottoman Egyptian rulers and northern Sudanese merchants even came to view southern peoples as slave reservoirs, which reinforced the radicalized hierarchies between the Arab North and African South. This also reinforced the trend of northern privilege found through state-controlled, harsh taxation of the southern region and conscription. This is supported in Johnson's academic journal, where he also states that, quote, "It was during this period of the 19th century that we can identify the beginnings of the North-South divide, with the two most important developments contributing to the divide being the impoverishment of certain areas of North Sudan through new forms of taxation and land ownership, and also contributed to the dramatic expansion of slave raiding and slave owning." The second main cause of the First Sudan Civil War can be found during the colonial rule of Sudan by the British during 1899 until Sudanese independence of 1956. In his book, The First Sudanese Civil War, African Arabs and Israelis in the Southern Sudan, Southern Sudanese professor Dr. Scopus S. Pargo describes how the British implemented its Southern policy. In a misguided effort to reduce Islam spreading into South Sudan, the British included political, educational, economic, and social policies which favored the North but adversely affected the South. For example, the British gave the South far fewer political appointments or any administrative or governmental training, barred government state schools in the South, leaving education to the underfunded Christian missionaries, put almost no infrastructure built in the South, with it primarily being concentrated in the North, and even barred northern movement to the South through the closed district ordinances of the 1920s and 30s, drastically isolating the South. A primary source example of this is the Passports and Permits Ordinance of 1922, which was published in the official Sudan Government Gazette, number 405. Furthermore, this mishandling was shown in the ignorance and neglect of Southern Sudanese representation after Sudanese independence in 1955. As author Robert Collins points out in his academic journal, Civil War in Sudan, the single most decisive folly, in his opinion, in the history of the Sudan conflict was the decision of Sudan's first prime minister after Sudan's independence in 1955, when the British withdrew, to allocate all of the major British governmental positions in the South to northern politicians. He argues that this decision reinforced all of the notions Southerners held that they were to be regarded as inferior and ignored in the matters of their own land and people by Northerners. This ultimately was reflected in what many consider to be the start of the war, the Torrid Mutiny of 1955. A direct quote from a Zandi chief in South Sudan from a chronology of international events published by the British Institute of International Affairs in 1955, who was urging his people to kill Northerners during the mutiny, gave his reasoning was due to the action of the Prime Minister reinforcing, quote, British warnings that Northerners wished to dominate the South. The third and arguably most important cause of the Civil War, which intensified after the failed Torrid Mutiny of 1955, which many consider to be the start of the war, was when during the interperiod of smaller armed resistance and struggle, the Sudanese government continued in its implementation of a militant form of Islam and repression against Southern hopes for federal autonomy. In his book, Dr. Pargo also explains how when General Ibrahim Aboud came into power via a bloodless military coup that overthrew the civilian government and ruled from 1958 to 1964, his primary goal was to quell Southern resistance and impose Arabization on the South. He set out to achieve his goal by instructing his governors in the 3 southern provinces to crush any Southerners who demanded federation, decreeing only Arabic as the national language in southern Sudan and enforcing it as the only language in government offices, as well as barring the expulsion of Christian missionaries in the South, and then finally imposing Islam on Southern education, even making knowledge of Islam and Arabic a requirement for admission into Southern schools. In the Journal of African History, author Oystein H. Robertson reflects this escalation of the Sudanese government in response to the mutiny, arguing that the start of the first civil war in Sudan was not the Torrent Mutiny of 1955, but was the violent escalation in counteraction fought by the South Sudan in 1963. This was because the conditions, in his opinion, of Northern implementation policies made Southern retaliation far more likely. A primary source that reflects these escalating conditions is a letter written by William Deng from exile, who was one of the founders of the military wing of the Anyanya fighting for the independence of South Sudan, to General Aboud in 1961. In this letter, in order to both persuade and confront the general, he reflects Southern frustrations and concerns about the general's, quote, absorption through Islamification. Also, he seeks to pressure the government by sending a copy of this letter to the United Nations, while also building a moral case for Southern autonomy. The First Sudan Civil War finally came to an end in 1972 with the Addis Ababa Agreement on the Problem in South Sudan, which was an official peace accord which was called, quote, the Law for Regional Self-Government in the Southern Provinces. This finally allowed for federal autonomy for South Sudan. However, as pointed out in his book, Dr. Pargo describes the weaknesses of this agreement that would ultimately contribute to the Second Sudan Civil War, including, quote, the agreement lacked the mechanisms for enforcing these laws. This was a serious structural problem for the regional government. Lawmakers could not enforce the laws. These weaknesses and the underlying main problems that started the conflict remain unsolved, would ultimately lead to the Second Sudan Civil War 11 years later in 1983. So what caused the First Sudan Civil War, or ultimately armed conflict in Sudan in general? I have argued that the causes for the war lay in a combination of, first, patterns of exploitative governance developed by the Sudanic states and the Ottoman Empire, second, economic and educational underdevelopment of the South during the British colonial states' mishandling of the area and eventual withdrawal, and finally, through the neglection or outright submission of the issue of Southern Sudanese self-determination in favor of implementing an Arab Islamic agenda and militant Islam to Sudan by the northern government. The future of Sudan remains unclear. Even today, these problems continue to persist in both Sudan and South Sudan. I think that by understanding the deeply historic and divisive history and reasoning behind armed conflict in Sudan, we may be able to have a more informed approach when it comes to trying to bridge peace in the area in the future.